A scream pierces the opulent dining car of the Midnight Express, stranded in an alpine blizzard. A wealthy industrialist lies dead, poisoned by cyanide in his meal. Hercule Poirot, the brilliant detective, steps into a locked car, where secrets simmer among a vengeful waiter, a blackmailed governess, and a disgraced conductor. As motives unravel, resentment, fear, betrayal, Poirot's little gray cells race against time to uncover the murderer before the snow clears and the killer escapes. Will justice prevail on this frozen journey of deception? Chapter 1. The journey begins. The Midnight Express wound its serpentine path through the snow-draped Alps, its wheels clacking rhythmically against the rails, a metronome to the night's quiet. Hercule Poirot sat alone at a table in the dining car, his small, precise hands adjusting the alignment of his silverware with the fastidious care of a man for whom order was paramount. The car itself was a study in elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over mahogany paneling, and starched, white linens draped tables set with gleaming cutlery. Yet, despite the opulence, an undercurrent of tension hung in the air. As though the train carried more than passengers through the frozen peaks, Poirot en route to Paris, after resolving a delicate matter of stolen diplomatic papers in Vienna, had anticipated a restful journey. His sharp eyes, bright beneath neatly arched brows, surveyed the dining car with habitual curiosity. He sipped his tisane, the steam curling upward, and allowed his mind to wander not aimlessly, for Poirot's mind never wandered without purpose, but with the disciplined freedom of a detective attuned to the subtlest cues. At a table to his left sat Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, a stout Englishman, whose florid cheeks and booming voice marked him as a man accustomed to command. His tailored suit strained slightly at the waist, and his gold watch chain glinted as he gestured expansively, addressing a young woman seated opposite him. Miss Clara Vane, as Poirot had overheard her introduced, was a study in contrasts. Her delicate frame, clad in a modest gray dress, seemed to shrink under Hawthorne's attention. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly, but her eyes large, hazel, and wary darted nervously as she offered polite, tight-lipped smiles. Hawthorne's laughter, too loud for the confined space, grated on Poirot's sensibilities. "Mon Dieu," he murmured to himself, "a man who speaks as if the world owes him an audience." The waiter, Pierre Leclerc, moved through the car, with a practiced efficiency that belied the strain in his pinched, sallow face. His dark eyes, shadowed by heavy brows, lingered on Hawthorne with a flicker of something Poirot could not yet name: disdain, perhaps, or something deeper. Leclerc's movements were precise as he delivered plates of steaming coq au vin, yet his hands, Poirot noted, trembled faintly when he served Hawthorne's table. Was it fatigue, or something more sinister? Poirot filed the observation away, his mind a ledger of human behavior. The conductor, Monsieur Dubois, entered the car, his uniform immaculate but his posture rigid, as though braced against an unseen weight. His thin mustache twitched as he scanned the passengers, his gaze lingering briefly on Hawthorne before he exchanged a curt nod with Leclerc. Dubois's duties, Poirot knew, extended beyond checking tickets. On a train like the Midnight Express, the conductor was the linchpin of order. Yet this man seemed ill at ease. He paused to adjust a misaligned napkin, a gesture that mirrored Poirot's own penchant for symmetry. But his hurried steps betrayed a mind preoccupied. The dining car hummed with the low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the clink of glasses, and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Outside, the Alps loomed, their snow-laden peaks ghostly in the moonlight. Poirot's gaze drifted to the other passengers, a Swiss banker, engrossed in his newspaper, an elderly French widow, her fingers tracing the rim of a wine glass, and a young Italian couple, whispering conspiratorially. Each, in their way, was a piece of the puzzle that was the Midnight Express, though none yet knew the role they would play. As Leclerc refilled Poirot's water glass, the detective caught a fleeting glimpse of the waiter's cufflinka, simple design, but tarnished, as though it had been worn through years of toil. "Merci," Monsieur Poirot said, his tone polite but probing. Leclerc met his eyes for a moment, then looked away, his lips tightening. Poirot's instincts stirred. There was a story here, he thought, one woven into the fabric of this journey. He did not yet know its shape, but Hercule Poirot, with his little gray cells, was never one to ignore the whisper of intrigue. The train lurched slightly, a reminder of its precarious path through the mountains. Poirot set down his tisane, his mind alight with possibilities. The dining car, for all its elegance, was a stage, and the players Hawthorne, Vane, Leclerc, Dubois were already in motion. What drama, he wondered, would unfold before the Midnight Express reached its destination? Chapter 2. A scream in the night. The Midnight Express hurtled through the alpine darkness. Its rhythmic clatter, a counterpoint to the stillness of the snowbound peaks beyond the windows. The dining car, bathed in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, had settled into a languid rhythm of clinking cutlery and murmured conversation. Hercule Poirot, seated at his solitary table, savored the delicate warmth of his tisane, the porcelain cup steady in his meticulous hands. His sharp eyes, ever alert, beneath the polished dome of his forehead, roamed the car, cataloguing the nuances of its occupants. The elegance of the setting, the starched linens, the gleaming silver, the soft sheen of mahogany belied an undercurrent of unease that Poirot, with his unerring instinct for human discord, had already sensed. At a nearby table, Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's boorish laughter erupted once more, slicing through the car's decorum like a blunt knife. The portly industrialist, his cheeks flushed with wine and self-importance, leaned toward Miss Clara Vane, whose delicate frame seemed to shrink further under his attentions. Her hazel eyes, wide with a quiet distress, flickered toward her untouched plate of coq au vin, as though seeking refuge in its simplicity. Poirot noted her discomfort, the way her fingers twisted the edge of her napkin, and filed it away in the ledger of his mind. Hawthorne, oblivious to her unease, gestured expansively, his gold watch chain glinting as he recounted some anecdote with the gusto of a man accustomed to dominating any room. Across the car, Pierre Leclerc, the waiter, moved with a precision that bordered on mechanical, his sallow face a mask of professional detachment. Yet Poirot, ever attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, caught the fleeting glances Leclerc cast toward Hawthorne, glances laden with a smoldering intensity that spoke of more than mere servitude. The waiter's hands, as he cleared a neighboring table, betrayed a faint tremor, and Poirot's gaze lingered on the tarnished cufflink at his wrist, a small detail that hinted at a life of unfulfilled ambition. Monsieur Dubois, the conductor, had re-entered the car moments earlier, his stiff posture and clipped movements suggesting a man burdened by more than the weight of his uniform. His thin mustache twitched as he surveyed the passengers, his eyes pausing briefly on Hawthorne before darting away. Poirot, sipping his tisane, noted the conductor's unease, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his logbook. Dubois's role demanded order, yet his demeanor suggested a man grappling with some private disarray. The clock above the dining car's entrance read 11:46 p.m., its hands ticking with an almost imperceptible slowness. The train, now deep in the mountains, seemed cocooned in a world of its own. The snow-laden peaks outside a silent barrier between the passengers and the rest of humanity. Poirot, his mind a crucible of observation, was about to return his attention to his tisane when a sudden, piercing scream shattered the car's fragile calm. The sound came from Miss Clara Vane, who had risen from her seat, her hands clutching the string of pearls at her throat. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with horror as she stared at Mr. Hawthorne, who sat motionless in his chair, his head slumped forward onto the table. The remnants of his coq au vin lay scattered across the plate, a fork still clutched in his limp hand. "He's dead." Miss Vane's voice, trembling but clear, cut through the stunned silence that followed her scream. The dining car erupted into chaos. The Swiss banker dropped his newspaper, his monocle falling to dangle against his waistcoat. The elderly French widow gasped, her wineglass trembling in her hand. The young Italian couple, their whispers silenced, stared in mute shock. Poirot, with the calm precision that defined him, set down his cup and rose, his small, neat figure moving swiftly to the center of the commotion. "Calm yourselves, mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice steady, commanding attention. "Remain in your places, s'il vous plaît." He knelt beside Hawthorne's body, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the scene with the intensity of a jeweler examining a flawed gem. The industrialist's face was contorted, his lips faintly blue, a sheen of perspiration glistening on his brow. Poirot leaned closer, his nostrils catching a faint, acrid scent, bitter almonds, unmistakable to a man of his experience. Cyanide, he thought, though he kept the deduction to himself, his expression inscrutable. He noted the half-eaten plate of coq au vin, the sauce congealing around the meat, and the glass of red wine, barely touched. Hawthorne's right hand, still gripping the fork, bore a slight tremor, as though death had caught him mid-motion. "Monsieur." Dubois pushed through the gathering crowd, his face pale beneath his mustache. "What has happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with authority, but undercut by a quiver of unease. "Step back, all of you." He glanced at Poirot, his eyes narrowing briefly, as though weighing the detective's presence. "Monsieur Hawthorne is dead," Poirot said simply, rising to his feet, "and it is no natural death, I fear." The words, spoken with quiet certainty, sent a ripple of murmurs through the passengers. Miss Vane, trembling, sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face. The Italian couple exchanged hurried whispers, while the banker adjusted his monocle, his face a mask of disapproval. Poirot's gaze shifted to Pierre Leclerc, who stood frozen near the service door, a tray of empty glasses clutched in his hands. The waiter's eyes, dark and unreadable, met Poirot's for a fleeting moment before darting away. In that instant, Poirot's sharp senses caught a subtle movement Leclerc's left hand, slipping into the pocket of his apron, as though to conceal something. A vial, perhaps. Poirot's mind seized on the detail, storing it alongside the waiter's earlier agitation. "Lock the car, Monsieur Dubois," Poirot instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No one enters or leaves until we have clarity." Dubois hesitated, then nodded, barking orders to a junior steward who scurried to secure the doors. The dining car, now a sealed chamber, felt smaller, the air thick with suspicion. Poirot turned to Miss Vane, whose trembling had subsided into a fragile composure. "Mademoiselle," you screamed. "Tell me, what did you see?" His voice was gentle, but his eyes, bright and piercing, missed nothing. I don't know," she stammered, her hands twisting the pearls. He was talking, laughing, and then he just stopped. His face went pale, and he fell forward. I thought he was choking, but... Her voice trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Poirot nodded, his mind already reconstructing the scene. The speed of Hawthorne's collapse suggested a fast-acting poison, administered moments before death. Cyanide, if his nose was correct, worked swiftly, often within minutes. He glanced at the plate, the fork, the wineglass. The poison could have been in any of them or none, if delivered by some other means. But the dining car's isolation, its locked doors, narrowed the possibilities. The answer, he knew, lay among those present. "Monsieur Dubois," Poirot said, turning to the conductor, who served Monsieur Hawthorne's meal. Dubois's eyes flicked toward Leclerc, who stood rigidly by the service door. "Pierre, the head waiter, handled all the dishes tonight," he said, his tone clipped. "The kitchen staff prepared the food, but Pierre served it." Leclerc's face tightened, though he said nothing. Poirot noted the reaction, his mind cataloging the waiter's earlier tremor, the hidden movement in his pocket, And you, Monsieur Leclerc, Poirot said, his voice deceptively mild. You served Monsieur Hawthorne yourself. Yes, Monsieur Leclerc replied, his voice low, controlled. I brought his plate, as I did for the others, nothing more. Poirot's mustache twitched slightly, a sign of his mind at work. We shall see, he murmured, almost to himself. He turned to the passengers, who watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination. Mesdames et messieurs, a crime has been committed. A man is dead, and the hand that struck him is among us. I, Hercule Poirot, will uncover the truth, for it is my métier to restore order where chaos reigns. The passengers stirred, some with indignation, others with unease. The Swiss banker muttered about delays, while the French widow clutched her rosary. Miss Vane's eyes remained fixed on Poirot, as though seeking reassurance in his calm authority. Dubois, his face a mask of professional concern, began ushering passengers back to their seats, though his hands betrayed a nervous energy. Poirot returned to Hawthorne's table, his eyes sweeping over the scene once more. The plate, the wine, the forecastle were pieces of a puzzle that demanded his little gray cells. He noted the position of the body, the angle of the head, the faint smear of sauce on Hawthorne's chin. Every detail, however small, was a thread in the tapestry of murder. He glanced at the service door, where Leclerc had stood, and then at the locked windows, their frames frosted with snow. The car was a sealed box, yet death had found its way inside. As Dubois organized the removal of Hawthorne's body to a private compartment, Poirot's mind churned. The bitter almond scent, the locked car, the waiter's concealed movement all pointed to a deliberate act, planned with care. But why? Hawthorne, for all his boorishness, was a man of wealth and influence. Who among these passengers or staff had motive to kill him? And how had the poison been administered in a room full of witnesses? Poirot's gaze settled on Miss Vane, whose pale face and trembling hands suggested more than mere shock. Had she known Hawthorne before this journey, as her discomfort implied? Then there was Leclerc, whose resentment toward the industrialist seemed to simmer just beneath his servile exterior, and Dubois, the conductor, whose nervous tics hinted at a burden beyond his duties. Each was a suspect, each a piece of the puzzle that Poirot would methodically assemble. The train, halted by a sudden snowdrift, groaned as the wind battered its sides. The passengers, confined to the dining car, whispered among themselves, their eyes darting to Poirot, who stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back. The midnight express, once a haven of luxury, had become a stage for murder, and Hercule Poirot, with his unyielding commitment to truth, was its director. As the clock struck midnight, Poirot's mind was already at work, sifting through the fragments of evidence, the glances, the gestures, the unspoken tensions. The truth, he murmured to himself, is like the snow outside, cold, unyielding, but it will yield to the light of reason. The journey, he knew, had only just begun. Chapter 3. The locked car, the midnight express, stood motionless, ensnared by a snowdrift that cloaked the alpine tracks in an unyielding white shroud. Inside the dining car, now a silent witness to murder, the air was thick with the scent of cooling food and unspoken fears. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, neat figure a beacon of calm amid the passengers' restless murmurs. The chandeliers, their light now harsh against the pallor of shocked faces, cast long shadows across the polished mahogany tables. The body of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne had been discreetly removed to a private compartment under Monsieur Dubois's supervision, but the stain of death lingered, as tangible as the frost creeping along the windows. Poirot's sharp eyes, glinting with the intensity of a man whose mind never rested, surveyed the scene. The dining car's elegance had starched linens. Its gleaming silver seemed mocked by the crime it had hosted. The passengers, confined by Dubois's orders, sat in uneasy clusters, their voices hushed, but their glances sharp with suspicion. Miss Clara Vane, her delicate hands still clutching her pearls, stared at the empty table where Hawthorne had sat, her hazel eyes clouded with something Poirot could not yet name, fear, perhaps, or guilt. Pierre Leclerc, the waiter, hovered near the service door, his sallow face a mask of strained composure, though Poirot noted the faint clench of his jaw. Monsieur Dubois, pacing near the entrance, adjusted his uniform with mechanical precision, his thin mustache twitching as he avoided Poirot's gaze. "Monsieur Dubois," Poirot said, his voice clear and measured, cutting through the low hum of whispers. "A word, if you please." The conductor approached, his steps reluctant, as though each one brought him closer to an unwelcome truth. "Oui, Monsieur Poirot," he replied, his tone clipped but deferential. "What do you require?" Poirot's mustache curved slightly, a sign of his mind at work. "This dining car, Monsieur, it was locked during the meal, was it not? No one entered or left after the service began." Dubois nodded, his fingers tightening around his logbook. "Correct? The doors were secured at 11 p.m., as is our custom during dinner service. Only the passengers, myself, and the staff peer and the kitchen crew were present. The windows, as you can see, are sealed against the cold." Poirot's eyes flicked to the frosted windows, their frames unyielding, then back to Dubois and the service door. He asked, gesturing toward the narrow entrance near Leclerc's station. It too was locked. "Yes," Dubois said quickly, though his eyes darted briefly to Leclerc. "Pierre has the only key during service. It prevents interruptions." Bon Poirot murmured, his tone deceptively mild. He turned, his gaze sweeping the car, noting the positions of the tables, the placement of the passengers, the precise arrangement of Hawthorne's now empty chair. The locked car presented a puzzle as elegant as it was confounding a closed circle, yet within it, a murderer had struck. "A crime in a sealed room," he said softly, almost to himself, "is a challenge to the little gray cells, but one I shall meet." He addressed the passengers, his voice commanding attention. "Mesdames et messieurs, a tragedy has occurred, and it is my duty, Hercule Poirot's duty, to uncover its truth. A man has been poisoned, here, among us. I ask for your cooperation. Remain where you are until I have spoken with those most closely involved." The Swiss banker, his monocle glinting, muttered about delays, but a sharp glance from Poirot silenced him. The elderly French widow clutched her rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. The young Italian couple, their hands entwined, watched Poirot with wary curiosity. Miss Vane's eyes met his briefly, then dropped, her fingers twisting her napkin into knots. Poirot beckoned Dubois to a corner of the car, away from prying ears. "Monsieur, you knew the victim, did you not? Mr. Hawthorne was no ordinary passenger." Dubois's face tightened, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his logbook. "He was known to the company," he admitted. "A man of influence. He owned shares in the railway, and his voice carried weight in its operations. And in your operations, perhaps." Poirot's tone was gentle, but his eyes were piercing. "A man like Hawthorne leaves impressions, impressions that may linger in the hearts of those who serve him." Dubois's mustache twitched. "I performed my duties, Monsieur Poirot, nothing more." His voice was stiff, but Poirot noted the faint flush at his collar, the way his eyes avoided direct contact. "Very well," Poirot said, dismissing him with a nod. "But I shall require a list of all passengers and staff in this car tonight, and their movements before the scream." Dubois nodded curtly and retreated, his steps brisk, but unsteady. Poirot's gaze shifted to Pierre Leclerc, who remained near the service door, his hands clasped behind his back. The waiter's posture was rigid, but Poirot's keen senses detected a faint tremor in his stance, a flicker of unease in his dark eyes. "Monsieur Leclerc," Poirot called, his voice carrying the weight of authority wrapped in courtesy. "A moment, if you please." Leclerc approached, his movements deliberate, as though each step was a calculation. Yes, monsieur. His voice was low, guarded, with a trace of the French provinces in its cadence. You served Monsieur Hawthorne's meal, Poirot said, his eyes fixed on the waiter's face. Tell me, what did you observe of him tonight? His demeanor, his actions. Leclerc's jaw tightened, but his tone remained even. He was, as he always was, loud, demanding. He complained about the wine, said it was too warm, but he drank it anyway. I brought his coq au vin at 11:30, as I did for the others. He ate quickly, as he always did. Always. Poirot's eyebrow arched. You have served him before, then. Leclerc hesitated, a flicker of something anger, perhaps crossing his face before he masked it. He travels this route often. I have waited on him many times. And tonight, was there anything unusual? A request? A gesture? A word? Leclerc's eyes narrowed, but he shook his head. Nothing, monsieur. He was, as he always is, insulting, impatient. But I did my job. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. Mercy, Monsieur Leclerc. I may have further questions. As the waiter turned to go, Poirot's sharp eyes caught a subtle movement, the waiter's hand brushing against his apron pocket, as though checking its contents. The gesture, fleeting but deliberate, reignited Poirot's earlier suspicion. What had Leclerc concealed in that moment after the scream? Turning to Miss Vane, Poirot approached her table, his manner softening. Mademoiselle, you are distressed, and it is natural. But I must ask you, sat with Monsieur Hawthorne. Did you notice anything amiss before his collapse? Miss Vane's hands trembled as she smoothed her napkin, her eyes fixed on the table. He was himself, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He talked incessantly, boasted of his business ventures. I tried to be polite, but, she paused, her cheeks flushing. He made me uncomfortable. His manner was overbearing. Poirot tilted his head, studying her. And his meal? Did you see him eat? Drink? She nodded, her eyes flickering with memory. He ate quickly, as Pierre said. The coq au vin seemed to enjoy it. He drank a little wine, but not much. Then, suddenly, he stopped talking. His face changed, pale, twisted, and he fell forward. Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Poirot's gaze softened, but his mind was relentless. Merci, mademoiselle. Rest now, but remain here. He stepped away, his thoughts churning. The poisoned cyanide, if his nose was correct, had acted swiftly, suggesting it was administered during the meal. The locked car limited the suspects to those present. The passengers, Leclerc, Dubois, and perhaps the kitchen staff, though they had not entered the dining area. The key, he knew, lay in the timing and the means of delivery. He approached the table where Hawthorne had sat, now empty but for the remnants of his meal. The plate, smeared with sauce, held no obvious clues, but Poirot's meticulous eye noted the fork, its tines slightly bent, as though gripped with force. The wineglass, nearly full, bore no visible residue, but Poirot made a mental note to have it tested. The bitter almond scent, faint but unmistakable, clung to the air near the plate. Cyanide, he was certain, but how had it reached Hawthorne? Poirot turned to Dubois, who had returned with a hastily scrawled list of names. Monsieur, I will speak with the kitchen staff next, but first, tell me, where is the medical kit kept? On this train. Dubois blinked, caught off guard. In my office, near the front of the train. Why do you ask? Poirot's mustache twitched. A precaution, monsieur. Ensure it is secure. He did not elaborate, but his mind was already tracing a thread. Cyanide was not easily obtained, but a medical kit might contain compounds that could be adapted by a clever hand. As the passengers watched, their faces a gallery of fear and curiosity, Poirot stepped back, his hands clasped behind him. The dining car, with its locked doors and sealed windows, was a microcosm of human nature: ambition, resentment, fear, all simmering beneath the surface. The murderer, he knew, was among them, hidden behind a mask of innocence. But Hercule Poirot, with his little gray cells, would peel away that mask, layer by layer, until the truth stood revealed. The snow outside fell heavier now, cocooning the train in a silent, frozen world. The Midnight Express, stranded and motionless, was no longer a journey but a battlefield, and Poirot, its solitary general, was ready to wage war on the chaos of murder. Chapter 4. The waiter's tale. The Midnight Express remained entombed in snow, its steel frame groaning faintly under the weight of the Alpine blizzard. The dining car, now cleared of most passengers, save for those Poirot deemed essential, felt both cavernous and claustrophobic, its elegance marred by the specter of murder. Hercule Poirot stood near the service door, his small, immaculate figure a study in composure, his sharp eyes glinting with the relentless curiosity that defined him. The chandeliers cast a muted glow over the polished tables, but the air was heavy with suspicion. Each glance between the remaining occupants, Miss Clara Vane, Pierre Leclerc, and Monsieur Dubois laden with unspoken accusations. Poirot had requested the dining car be kept sealed, a request Monsieur Dubois had honored with a curt nod, though his twitching mustache betrayed his unease. The passengers, now dispersed to their compartments under the watchful eye of a junior steward, whispered of delays and danger, but Poirot's focus was singular. The poke to the murderer, the locked car, the swift poison, the bitter almond scent, all pointed to a deliberate act, and the key to the puzzle lay among those who had access to Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's final meal. He turned his attention to Pierre Leclerc, the waiter, who stood near the service door, his sallow face drawn tight, his dark eyes fixed on the floor. Leclerc's hands were clasped behind his back, but Poirot noted the faint rigidity in his posture, the subtle clench of his fingers. The waiter was a man under pressure, and Poirot, with his unerring instinct for human nature, sensed a story beneath the surface. Monsieur Leclerc, Poirot said, his voice smooth but commanding. I would speak with you, alone. He gestured toward a small alcove near the kitchen entrance, where a velvet curtain offered a semblance of privacy. Leclerc's eyes flickered with wariness, but he followed, his steps measured. Poirot drew the curtain partially closed, creating a confined space where the hum of the train's idling engine was the only sound. The detective sat on a cushioned bench, his hands folded neatly over his waistcoat, and motioned for Leclerc to sit opposite. The waiter perched on the edge of the seat, his posture rigid. You served Monsieur Hawthorne his meal, Poirot began, his tone conversational but his eyes piercing. A meal that ended his life. Tell me, monsieur, what passed between you and this man tonight? Leclerc's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping to his tarnished cufflink. I served him as I served the others, he said, his voice low and clipped, tinged with a provincial accent. Coq au vin wine, the usual. He was difficult, as always. But I did my job. Difficult, you say? Poirot tilted his head, his mustache twitching slightly. How so? Leclerc's eyes flashed, a spark of anger breaking through his restraint. He was loud, rude, complained about everything, the wine, the food, the service. He treated us like we were nothing. His voice grew taut, and he caught himself, his lips pressing into a thin line. But I served him, that's all. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. You have served him before, Nan, you said as always. This was not your first encounter with Monsieur Hawthorne. Leclerc hesitated, his fingers twitching. He travels this route often. Everyone knows him. He owns part of the railway company. He makes demands. Demands, Poirot repeated softly, his eyes never leaving Leclerc's face. And these demands, they weigh heavily on a man, do they not? A man who works long hours, whose wages, perhaps, do not reflect his labor. Leclerc's face darkened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You don't understand, monsieur. He didn't just demand service, He humiliated us. The staff, the conductors, he treated us like dogs. My wages. He stopped, his eyes darting to the side, as though regretting his words. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle, but unrelenting. Your wages, Monsieur Leclerc? Were they withheld, perhaps? Delayed by this man's influence? Leclerc's hands clenched, his knuckles whitening. The company is in his pocket, he said bitterly. Months, sometimes, we wait for payment. My family, my mother, she is ill, and I cannot. He broke off, his breath sharp, his eyes burning with suppressed rage. Poirot's mind catalogued every word, every gesture. The waiter's resentment was palpable, a motive as clear as the crystal chandeliers. Yet motive alone was not enough. The poisoned cyanide, Poirot was certain, required opportunity, and the locked dining car narrowed the possibilities. Tell me, Poirot continued, the coq au vin. You brought it directly from the kitchen. Yes, Leclerc said quickly. Straight from the chef. I placed it before him myself, and you touched nothing else. The wine, perhaps, the cutlery. Leclerc's eyes narrowed. The wine was poured by the sommelier. The cutlery was on the table. I only served the plate. His voice was steady, but Poirot noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead. Bon, Poirot said, rising with a nod. That is all for now, monsieur. But do not leave the train, n'est-ce pas? His tone was polite, but the command was unmistakable. Leclerc stood, his movements stiff, and returned to the service door, his hand brushing his apron pocket once more. Poirot's eyes lingered on the gesture, his memory flashing to the moment, after Miss Vane's scream, when Leclerc had slipped something into that pocket, a vial perhaps. The detective's little gray cells hummed with possibility. Poirot stepped back into the dining car, where Miss Vane and Dubois awaited, their faces etched with tension. He addressed Dubois next. Monsieur, I require access to the kitchen and its staff. And the medical kit, where is it now? Dubois's mustache twitched. The kitchen is through the service door. The medical kit is in my office, locked. I'll take you there. Poirot nodded, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The locked car, the poison, Leclerc's rage-all were threads in a tapestry of murder, but the pattern remained elusive. He followed Dubois, his steps measured, his thoughts racing. The waiter's tale was one of resentment, but was it the whole truth? Poirot's instincts told him there was more to uncover, and he would not rest until every secret was laid bare. The snow outside continued to fall, sealing the midnight express in its icy prison. The dining car, once a haven of luxury, was now a stage for justice, and Hercule Poirot, with his relentless pursuit of order, was its master. Chapter 5. The governess's secret. The midnight express, ensnared in the relentless grip of the alpine snow, stood as still as a monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its elegant confines. The dining car, now emptied of all but the essential figures, seemed to hold its breath, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting an almost spectral light over the polished tables. Hercule Poirot, his small frame radiating an unyielding authority, moved with deliberate grace toward Miss Clara Vane, who sat alone at her table, her delicate hands clasped tightly around a crumpled napkin. Her auburn hair, still neatly pinned, framed a face pale with strain, her hazel eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and resolve. Poirot's mind, a crucible of logic and intuition, churned with the details of the case. The locked dining car, the bitter almond scent of cyanide, Pierre Leclerc's suppressed rage-all were pieces of a puzzle that demanded precision to solve. Yet Miss Vane, the young governess who had sat opposite the murdered Reginald Hawthorne, was an enigma in her own right. Her nervous demeanor during dinner, her scream at the moment of his collapse, suggested a connection to the victim that went beyond mere chance. Poirot, with his unerring instinct for the human heart, knew that her story held a key to the truth. Mademoiselle Vane, he said, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of command. I would speak with you, if you permit. In private, perhaps, to ease your mind. He gestured toward the observation car, a glass-domed sanctuary at the rear of the train, where the snow-draped Alps loomed like silent sentinels. Miss Vane hesitated, her fingers tightening around the napkin, then nodded. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She rose, her gray dress whispering against the floor, and followed him through the narrow corridor to the observation car. The space was bathed in moonlight, the snow outside refracting a pale, ethereal glow. Poirot closed the door behind them, ensuring their conversation would not be overheard. He motioned for her to sit on one of the plush velvet seats, and he took the one opposite, his hands folded neatly over his waistcoat. "Mademoiselle," he began, his tone gentle but probing, "you were seated with Monsieur Hawthorne tonight. A man, I observe, who made you uneasy. Tell me, what was your connection to him?" Miss Vane's eyes dropped to her lap, her fingers twisting the napkin into knots. I had only met him by chance," she said, her voice trembling. "He insisted on joining me at my table. I could not refuse without causing a scene." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of his mind at work. "By chance, you say? Yet your discomfort was evident, mademoiselle. A woman of your refinement does not shrink from a man's company without reason. Speak plainly, I implore you. The truth is the only path to clarity." Her cheeks flushed, and she drew a shaky breath. "He was overbearing," she admitted. "He spoke of his wealth, his influence, as though I should be impressed. I found him crude, but I endured it. I am a governess, Monsieur Poirot. I am accustomed to enduring." Poirot's eyes narrowed, catching the faint quiver in her voice. "Enduring, yes. But there is more, n'est-ce pas? A governess does not scream as you did, unless the heart is touched by more than distaste." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "What did Monsieur Hawthorne mean to you, mademoiselle?" Miss Vane's hand stilled, and for a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant creak of the train's frame. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded letter, its edges worn as though handled often. "This," she whispered, passing it to Poirot. "He gave it to me yesterday, before we boarded." Poirot unfolded the letter with care, his sharp eyes scanning the bold, sprawling handwriting. It was brief but damning, addressed to Miss Vane and signed by Reginald Hawthorne. The words spoke of a debtor. Her brother, a clerk in one of Hawthorne's enterprises, had allegedly embezzled. The letter promised discretion in exchange for her cooperation, the implication clear in its veiled menace. Poirot's expression remained impassive, but his mind raced. Blackmail, he thought, a motive as old as human greed. "You see," Miss Vane said, her voice breaking, "he threatened to ruin my brother, to expose him. My family. We have nothing, Monsieur Poirot. My brother is all I have left. I could not refuse him, but I did not harm him." Poirot folded the letter and returned it to her, his movements deliberate. "You hated him, mademoiselle," he said, not a question but a statement, delivered with quiet certainty. Her eyes filled with tears, but she met his gaze with unexpected resolve. "Yes," she said, her voice steady now. "I hated him, but I am no murderer. I sat at his table because he demanded it. I listened to his boasts because I had no choice. But I did not touch his food, his wine, nothing." Poirot nodded, his mind cataloging her words, her demeanor. Her candor was compelling, but he knew the heart could conceal as much as it revealed. "And tonight," he said, "you saw him eat, drink. Was there anything unusual? A pause, a gesture, a taste that seemed amiss?" Miss Vane frowned, her brow creasing as she recalled the scene. He ate quickly, as he always did. The coq au vin he seemed to relish it, though he complained about the sauce being too rich. He drank a sip of wine, then pushed it aside. Then, He stopped, clutched his throat, and fell forward. Her voice wavered, but her eyes were clear. It happened so fast. Poirot's thoughts turned to the poison cyanide, swift and merciless. The dining car's locked state meant the poison had been administered there by someone with access to Hawthorne's meal. Miss Vane, seated across from him, had no opportunity to tamper with his food, unless she had acted with extraordinary cunning. Yet her fear, her trembling hands, suggested a woman trapped, not a schemer. Mercy. Mademoiselle Poirot said, rising. Your honesty is noted. Remain in the dining car for now, if you please. His tone was kind, but his eyes held a glint of scrutiny as Miss Vane returned to her seat. Poirot lingered in the observation car, his gaze drifting to the snow beyond the glass. The letter was a revelation, a thread that tied Miss Vane to Hawthorne, through fear and coercion. Blackmail was a powerful motive, but her lack of access to the meal weakened her as a suspect. Still, Poirot knew better than to dismiss her entirely. The heart of a governess, pushed to desperation, could harbor secrets, as dark as any. He returned to the dining car, where Pierre Leclerc and Monsieur Dubois awaited, their faces etched with tension. Leclerc's hand rested near his apron pocket, a gesture Poirot noted with renewed interest. Dubois, meanwhile, clutched his logbook as though it were a shield. The locked car, the poison, the motives each, was a piece of the puzzle, and Poirot's little gray cells were alight with the challenge of fitting them together. The snow continued to fall, sealing the midnight express in its frozen prison. The truth, Poirot knew, was buried somewhere within this car. Among these people, he would unearth it, layer by layer, until the murderer stood revealed in the cold light of reason. Chapter 6. The Conductor's Burden. The Midnight Express, immobilized by the relentless alpine snow, stood as a silent monument to the crime that had shattered its opulent calm. Within the dining car, now a hushed arena of suspicion, the air was thick with the residue of fear and unspoken truths. Hercule Poirot, his small figure radiating a quiet authority, stood near the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the faces of those who remained. Miss Clara Vane, her delicate frame hunched over a crumpled napkin. Pierre Leclerc, the waiter, whose sallow countenance betrayed a simmering unease, and Monsieur Dubois, the conductor, whose rigid posture and twitching mustache hinted at a man wrestling with an invisible weight. The chandeliers cast a muted glow over the polished mahogany, but their light seemed to falter, as though reluctant to illuminate the darkness of the deed committed here. Poirot's mind, a labyrinth of logic and intuition, churned with the fragments of the puzzle. The locked car, the cyanide's bitter almond scent, Leclerc's concealed vial, Miss Vane's damning letter. Each was a thread, but the pattern remained elusive. Now, his focus turned to Monsieur Dubois, the conductor, whose nervous tics and evasive glances suggested a story yet untold. Monsieur Dubois, Poirot said, his voice clear and measured, cutting through the oppressive silence. I would speak with you, if you please, in your office, perhaps, where we may have privacy. Dubois's eyes flickered with unease, but he nodded, his fingers tightening around the logbook clutched to his chest. Very well, Monsieur Poirot, he replied, his tone clipped, but deferential. This way. Poirot followed the conductor through the narrow corridor, to a small office at the front of the train. A cramped space lined with maps, timetables, and a locked cabinet. A single lamp cast a stark light over the desk, cluttered with papers, and a worn leather chair. Dubois closed the door, his movements brisk, but betraying a faint tremor. He gestured for Poirot to sit, but the detective remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, his mustache twitching slightly as his mind worked. You are the guardian of this train, Monsieur Dubois, Poirot began, his tone conversational, but his eyes piercing. Its order, its safety, these are your responsibilities. Yet a man lies dead, poisoned in your dining car. Tell me, what do you know of Monsieur Hawthorne? Dubois's mustache twitched, and he adjusted his uniform, a gesture Poirot recognized as a shield against scrutiny. He was a passenger, Dubois said, his voice steady but guarded. A man of means, as you know. He owned shares in the railway company. His presence was felt, you say? Poirot tilted his head, his gaze unrelenting. A man of his stature leaves impressions, Nan. Impressions that may weigh heavily on those who serve under his influence. Dubois's fingers tightened on the logbook, his knuckles whitening. He was demanding, he admitted, his voice low. He expected perfection schedules met, service flawless. He had the power to enforce his will. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And you, monsieur, felt this power? Perhaps in a way that touched your career, your pride? Dubois's face tightened, a flush creeping up his neck. I was demoted, he said abruptly, as though the words were wrenched from him. 2 years ago, I was chief conductor on the Paris line. Hawthorne, he complained about a delay, a trivial matter, but his word was law. I was reassigned to this route, a lesser post. His voice was bitter, but he caught himself, his eyes darting to Poirot. I bore it. I did my duty. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. A demotion is a wound to a man's pride, n'est-ce pas, especially for one who values order, as you do. He gestured to the desk, where the logbook lay open, its entries meticulous. Your records are precise, monsieur. Tell me, what did you note tonight, before Monsieur Hawthorne's death? Dubois hesitated, then opened the logbook, his fingers trembling slightly. I checked the dining car at 10:45 p.m., before service began. All was in order, tables set, staff in place. I was at the front of the train when the scream came. Poirot's gaze lingered on the logbook, noting a smudged entry dated earlier that day. And this? He asked, pointing to the mark. What does it signify? Dubois's eyes widened briefly, then he recovered. A mistake, he said quickly. I corrected an entry about the medical kit. It was misplaced earlier, but I found it. Misplaced. Poirot's voice was soft, but his eyes gleamed with interest. The medical kit, which may contain substances of interest in a case of poisoning. Where is it now? In the cabinet, Dubois said, pointing to the locked metal box behind the desk. It is secure, Bon Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. I will examine it later. For now, tell me, did you see Monsieur Hawthorne tonight? Before the meal, Dubois shook his head. Only briefly, when I checked the car. He was already seated, talking with Mademoiselle Vane. I had no direct contact with him. Poirot's mind catalogued the conductor's words, his demeanor. The demotion was a motive, a wound to a man's dignity that could fester into vengeance. Yet Dubois's alibi, if true, placed him far from the dining car at the critical moment. The medical kit, however, was a new threat, a potential source of the cyanide that had ended Hawthorne's life. Poirot's little gray cells hummed with possibility. Merci, Monsieur Dubois, he said, rising. You have been most helpful. Ensure the kit remains untouched, if you please. Dubois nodded, his face a mask of strained composure, and Poirot stepped back into the corridor, his thoughts racing. The conductor's burden was clear resentment born of humiliation, a career diminished by Hawthorne's hand. But had it driven him to murder? The locked car, the swift poison, suggested a plan executed with precision, and Dubois's meticulous nature made him a candidate. Yet the medical kit's misplacement raised questions. Had it been accessed, its contents tampered with? Returning to the dining car, Poirot found Miss Vane and Leclerc in their respective places, their faces etched with tension. Leclerc's hand, once again, brushed his apron pocket, a gesture Poirot noted with heightened suspicion. Miss Vane's eyes followed him, her expression a mix of fear and hope, as though she saw in him her salvation or her doom. The snow outside continued to fall, sealing the midnight express in its icy embrace. The dining car, with its locked doors and hidden truths, was a microcosm of human frailty, and Poirot, with his relentless pursuit of order, was determined to unravel its secrets. The conductor's burden, like Leclerc's rage and Vane's fear, was another piece of the puzzle, and Poirot's mind was alight with the challenge of fitting them together. Chapter 7. The Poison's Path. The Midnight Express, ensnared in the unyielding grip of the Alpine blizzard, stood motionless, its steel frame a silent sentinel amid the snow-draped peaks. Within the dining car, the air was thick with the weight of suspicion, the once elegant space now a stage for a grim tableau of murder. Hercule Poirot, his small figure radiating an unshakable calm, stood near the table where Reginald Hawthorne had met his end, his sharp eyes scanning the remnants of the fatal meal. The chandeliers cast a pallid glow over the polished mahogany, but their light seemed to falter, as though reluctant to illuminate the truth lurking in the shadows. The passengers had been dismissed to their compartments, save for Miss Clara Vane, Pierre Leclerc, and Monsieur Dubois, who remained under Poirot's watchful eye. Miss Vane sat rigidly, her hazel eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Leclerc lingered near the service door, his sallow face a mask of restraint, though Poirot noted the subtle tension in his posture. Dubois, clutching his logbook, paced near the entrance, his mustache twitching with nervous energy. The locked car, the bitter almond scent of cyanide, the motives of resentment and fear, all were threads in a tapestry of crime that Poirot was determined to unravel. His mind, a crucible of logic and precision, returned to the mechanics of the murder. The poison cyanide, he was certain, given the telltale scent, had acted with devastating speed, felling Hawthorne within minutes of its ingestion. The locked dining car, with its sealed windows and secured doors, narrowed the field of opportunity, pointing inexorably to those present during the meal. Poirot's little gray cells churned, piecing together the timeline, the movements, the possibilities. He approached the table where Hawthorne had sat, now cleared of its occupant, but not its evidence. The plate, smeared with the remnants of coq au vin, sat undisturbed, the sauce congealed into a dark pool. The wineglass, nearly full, bore no visible residue, and the fork, its tines slightly bent, lay beside a crumpled napkin. Poirot knelt, his eyes narrowing as he examined the plate. The faint, acrid scent of bitter almonds lingered, strongest near the sauce, confirming his suspicion. The poison had been in the food, not the wine, a deliberate choice, for cyanide's taste, though subtle, could be masked by the rich flavors of the dish. Monsieur Dubois, Poirot called, his voice cutting through the silence. Summon the train's doctor, if you please, and the chef who prepared this meal. Dubois nodded, his face pale, and hurried from the car. Poirot turned to Leclerc, who stood rigidly by the service door. Monsieur Leclerc, you served this plate. Tell me, how did it pass from the kitchen to Monsieur Hawthorne's table? Leclerc's eyes flickered, but his voice was steady. I took it from the chef, as always. It was prepared with the others, plated in the kitchen. I carried it directly to his table at 11:30, and you touched nothing. Poirot's tone was mild, but his gaze was unrelenting. No adjustment to the sauce, no addition to the dish. Leclerc's jaw tightened. Nothing, monsieur. I served it as it came. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable, but his mind seized on the waiter's defensiveness, the faint tremor in his hand as it brushed his apron pocket. The vial, glimpsed in that fleeting moment after the scream, remained a tantalizing clue, though Leclerc's denials were resolute. The door swung open, admitting Dr. Moreau, the train's physician, a wiry man with a lined face and steady hands. Behind him came Chef Renaud, a burly figure whose apron bore the stains of his trade. Dubois followed, his logbook still clutched like a talisman. Dr. Moreau, Poirot said, his voice commanding attention, you have examined Monsieur Hawthorne's body. What can you tell me? Moreau adjusted his spectacles, his tone clinical. Death by poisoning, almost certainly. The blue lips, The convulsions, the rapid onset all suggest cyanide, likely potassium cyanide, given the symptoms. I detected a faint bitter almond scent on his breath, which confirms it. Poirot's mustache twitched, and the stomach contents. You analyzed the meal. Moreau nodded. I took samples from the plate. The coq then contained a high concentration of cyanide, concentrated in the sauce. The wine was untouched by it. Bon Poirot murmured, his eyes gleaming. The poison's path was narrowing. He turned to Chef Renaud, whose broad face was flushed with unease. Monsieur, you prepared the coq au vin. Tell me of its journey, from your kitchen. Renaud wiped his hands on his apron, his voice gruff. I cooked the dishes myself, 6 plates, all the same. The sauce was made in a single pot, served evenly. No one tampered with it in my kitchen, I swear. My staff 2 sous chefs were with me the whole time. We sent the plates out at 11:25, and Pierre took them. Poirot's gaze sharpened. You are certain, monsieur, that no one could have added anything to the sauce before it left your hands? Renaud's eyes widened, indignant. Impossible. I watched every step. The kitchen is small, and I trust my men. The plates were clean when they left. Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The poison, then, had been introduced after the plate left the kitchen, likely in the dining car itself. Leclerc, as the server, had the clearest opportunity. But the locked car meant others could have acted, provided they were cunning. He turned to Dubois. The service door, monsieur. You said Monsieur Leclerc holds the only key during dinner. Dubois nodded, his fingers twitching. Yes, it's locked to prevent interruptions. Only Pierre can open it. Poirot's eyes flicked to Leclerc, who stood silent, his hand once again near his pocket. The waiter's opportunity was undeniable, but the poison's source remained elusive. Cyanide was not a common substance, yet Dubois's mention of the misplaced medical kit lingered in Poirot's mind. Could it have contained the lethal compound? Dr. Moreau, Poirot said, turning back to the physician, the medical kit. On this train, what does it contain? Moreau frowned, considering standard supplies: bandages, antiseptics, some medications. There's a small vial of potassium cyanide, used for chemical tests in emergencies. But it's locked in the conductor's office. Poirot's gaze shifted to Dubois, whose face paled slightly. And this kit, Monsieur Poirot said, his voice soft but unyielding. You said it was misplaced earlier today. When did you find it? Dubois hesitated, his mustache twitching. This afternoon, it was, in the wrong drawer. I returned it to the cabinet and locked it. Bon, Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. I will examine this kit myself, if you please. As Dubois nodded and led Dr. Moreau and Renaud back to their duties, Poirot returned to Hawthorne's table, his mind reconstructing the timeline. At 11:25, the plates left the kitchen, untouched by poison. At 11:30, Leclerc served Hawthorne's meal. By 11:45, the man was dead, the cyanide acting with brutal efficiency. The poison had been added in that narrow window, likely by someone with access to the plate Leclerc, most obviously, but Poirot knew better than to leap to conclusions. The medical kit, the locked door, the motives of resentment and furor demanded scrutiny. He glanced at Miss Vane, whose pale face and trembling hands suggested a woman haunted by more than shock. Her letter from Hawthorne, a tool of blackmail, gave her motive, but her lack of access to the kitchen or the plate weakened her as a suspect. Leclerc's rage, Dubois's demotion, each was a thread. But the poison's path was the key to unraveling the truth. The snow outside fell heavier, sealing the midnight express in its icy prison. The dining car, with its locked doors and hidden secrets, was a crucible of human nature, and Poirot, with his relentless pursuit of order, was determined to trace the poison to its source. The truth, he knew, was close, waiting to be illuminated by the light of his little gray cells. Chapter 8. A clue in the snow. The Midnight Express remained locked in the icy embrace of the alpine blizzard, its steel frame groaning faintly against the relentless wind. The dining car, now a somber reliquary of the crime, stood nearly empty, its chandeliers casting a cold, wavering light over the polished tables. Hercule Poirot, his small figure, a beacon of unwavering resolve, paced slowly near the service door, his sharp eyes glinting with the intensity of a mind in relentless pursuit of truth. The snow outside fell in thick, silent curtains, sealing the train in a world apart, where the murder of Reginald Hawthorne loomed like a specter over the stranded passengers. Poirot's thoughts churned with the precision of a finely tuned mechanism. The locked dining car, the cyanide-laced coq au vin, the motives of Pierre Leclerc's resentment, Clara Vane's blackmail, and Monsieur Dubois's demotion formed a complex tapestry. Yet the final thread, the poison's delivery, remained elusive. The medical kit, with its potential store of cyanide, was a tantalizing lead, but Poirot knew that evidence, not supposition, would unlock the puzzle. His little gray cells demanded action, and the frozen landscape beyond the train's windows called to him with the promise of a clue. He turned to Monsieur Dubois, who stood near the entrance, his logbook clutched tightly, his thin mustache twitching with unease. "Monsieur Poirot," said, his voice calm but commanding, "I must examine the exterior of the dining car. The snow may hold secrets that the interior conceals." Dubois's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm crossing his face. "The snow, Monsieur Poirot. It is a blizzard out there, dangerous, and the cold is fierce." Poirot's mustache curved slightly, a sign of his unshakable determination. "The cold, monsieur, is no match for the fire of truth. Provide me with a coat and a lantern, if you please." With a reluctant nod, Dubois summoned a steward, who returned with a heavy wool coat and a handheld lantern, its flame flickering behind a glass shield. Poirot donned the coat, its bulk dwarfing his small frame, and adjusted his hat with meticulous care. "Remain here," he instructed Dubois, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Ensure no one enters or leaves the car." Stepping through the service door, Poirot emerged into a world of blinding white. The wind howled, whipping snow against his face, but he pressed forward, the lantern casting a feeble glow against the drifts. The dining car's exterior loomed beside him, its windows frosted, its steel frame dusted with snow. He moved carefully, his polished shoes sinking into the powdery drifts, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. Near the service door, where Pierre Leclerc had stood during the meal, Poirot's lantern illuminated a faint irregularity in the snow footprints, partially obscured by fresh snowfall, but distinct enough to trace. They led away from the door, toward a small mound, some 10 feet from the train. Poirot knelt, shielding the lantern with his body, and examined the tracks. They were narrow, suggesting a man's shoe, and the stride was hurried, as though the maker had moved with purpose. The snow, falling heavily, had softened their edges. But Poirot's keen eye estimated they were no more than an hour old made, perhaps, in the chaos following Hawthorne's death, at the mound. Poirot brushed away the snow with gloved hands, revealing a small, metallic object glinting in the lantern's light. It was a cigarette case, silver but tarnished, its surface engraved with the initials P.L. Pierre Leclerc. Poirot's heart quickened, though his expression remained impassive. He opened the case, finding it empty save for a faint trace of white powder clinging to the interior. Cyanide, he suspected, though confirmation would require analysis. He slipped the case into his pocket, his mind racing with the implications. The footprints in the case suggested a desperate act. Someone, likely Leclerc, had slipped out of the dining car to dispose of evidence, only to be thwarted by the snow's rapid accumulation. But the locked door complicated the theory. Leclerc held the key, yet the car had remained sealed during the meal. Had he unlocked it briefly, unnoticed by the passengers? Or was there another explanation? Poirot retraced his steps, the wind biting at his exposed face, and re-entered the dining car, shaking snow from his coat. The warmth of the car was a sharp contrast to the frozen world outside, but the chill of suspicion remained. Miss Vane, seated at her table, looked up as he entered, her hazel eyes wide with curiosity. Le clerc, near the service door, stiffened, his hand hovering near his apron pocket. Dubois, still clutching his logbook, approached, his face pale. "You found something, Monsieur Poirot?" Dubois asked, his voice tight. Poirot's eyes gleamed, but he revealed nothing. "Perhaps, Monsieur, but first, I must speak with Monsieur Le—" He beckoned the waiter to the alcove where they had spoken before, the velvet curtain drawn for privacy. Leclerc followed, his movements rigid, his dark eyes wary. Poirot sat, his hands folded, and fixed the waiter with a piercing gaze. "Monsieur Leclerc," he said, his voice soft but unyielding, "you have been most helpful, but there is a matter we must clarify." He produced the cigarette case, holding it delicately between gloved fingers. "It bears your initials, does it not?" Leclerc's face drained of color, his eyes fixed on the case. It is mine," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I lost it days ago. I don't know how it got out there." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Lost, you say? Yet it was found in the snow, near the service door you guard, and inside, a trace of powder, perhaps the very poison that killed Monsieur Hawthorne. Explain this, if you please." Leclerc's hands trembled, his composure cracking. "I swear, Monsieur, I don't know. I haven't seen that case since last week. Someone must have taken it, placed it there too." "To what, Monsieur?" Poirot's voice was sharp now, cutting through Leclerc's protest. "To implicate you? Or to conceal your own actions? You served the meal. You held the key to the service door. And now, your cigarette case is found with traces of what may be cyanide. These are not coincidences, Monsieur Leclerc." The waiter's eyes darted to the side, his breath uneven. "I didn't kill him," he said, his voice hoarse. "I hated him, yes, his insults, his arrogance, the way he held our wages over us. But I didn't do this." Poirot leaned back, his expression unreadable. "We shall see," he said softly. "For now, you will remain where I can observe you." As Leclerc returned to his post, Poirot's mind churned. The cigarette case was a damning clue, but its discovery in the snow raised questions. Had Leclerc, in a moment of panic, attempted to discard evidence, only to be foiled by the blizzard? Or had another hand placed it there, seeking to shift suspicion? The locked car, the poisons, swift action. The motives of those present all pointed to a carefully orchestrated crime. Yet the details refused to align. Poirot glanced at Miss Vane, whose pale face betrayed her fear, and Dubois, whose nervous tic suggested a man hiding more than he revealed. The snow outside, a silent witness to the night's secrets, had yielded a clue, but the truth remained buried. Hercule Poirot, with his relentless pursuit of order, knew that the next step, examining the medical kit and confirming the powder's nature, would bring him closer to the heart of the mystery. The Midnight Express, stranded in its frozen prison, was a crucible of human frailty, and Poirot's little gray cells were alight with the challenge of uncovering its darkest secret. Chapter 9. The motive unraveled. The Midnight Express, a prisoner of the alpine snow, stood silent under the weight of the blizzard, its opulent interior now a shadowed stage for the drama of murder. The dining car, with its gleaming mahogany and flickering chandeliers, bore the weight of unspoken tensions, the air thick with the residue of suspicion. Hercule Poirot, his small figure radiating an unyielding authority, stood at the center of the room, his sharp eyes glinting with the clarity of a mind that saw beyond the surface. The snow outside fell in relentless sheets, sealing the train in a frozen cocoon, but within Poirot's little gray cells burned with the fire of revelation. The cigarette case, with its damning initials and trace of white powder, rested in Poirot's pocket, a tangible link to the crime that had felled Reginald Hawthorne. The locked dining car, the cyanide-laced coq au vin, the motives of Pierre Leclerc's resentment, Clara Vane's blackmail, and Monsieur Dubois's demotion formed a complex web, but the discovery in the snow had sharpened Poirot's focus. The waiter, Leclerc, was the linchpin, his access to the meal and the service door making him the most likely hand to have delivered the poison. Yet Poirot, ever cautious of leaping to conclusions, knew that truth required evidence, not merely suspicion. He had summoned Leclerc, Miss Vane, and Dubois back to the dining car, along with Dr. Moreau, the train's physician, to confirm the nature of the powder. The passengers, confined to their compartments, whispered of the unfolding drama, but Poirot's command was absolute. No one would leave until the murderer was revealed. The four figures stood before him now, a tableau of Onesmus Vane, her delicate hands clutching her reticule. Leclerc, his sallow face taut with suppressed emotion. Dubois, his logbook a shield against scrutiny. And Dr. Moreau, his clinical demeanor a stark contrast to the tension around him. Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, cutting through the silence like a blade. Mesdames et messieurs, we stand in the presence of a crime most foul. Monsieur Hawthorne was poisoned cyanide, administered in his meal, in this very car, locked and sealed. The question is not only who, but how and why. And now, we have a clue that brings us closer to the truth. He produced the cigarette case, holding it aloft in his gloved hand. The silver glinted in the chandelier's light, the initials P.A. stark against its tarnished surface. Leclerc's face drained of color, his dark eyes fixed on the object. Miss Vane's breath caught, while Dubois's mustache twitched, his fingers tightening on his logbook. Dr. Moreau adjusted his spectacles, his expression one of professional curiosity. Monsieur Leclerc, Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild, this case bears your initials. It was found in the snow, near the service door you alone control, and within it, a trace of white powder suspected cyanide. Explain this, if you please. Leclerc's hands trembled, his voice hoarse. I told you, monsieur, I lost that case days ago. Someone must have taken it, used it to what? Poirot's voice sharpened, his eyes piercing. To frame you, or to conceal your own act. You served the meal. You held the key to the service door. You had motive your wages withheld, your pride wounded by Monsieur Hawthorne's insults. Speak, monsieur, and let the truth emerge. Leclerc's composure cracked, his shoulders slumping. I hated him, he said, his voice breaking. He was a tyrant. He held our wages, mocked my father, a railway man who died in poverty because of men like Hawthorne. Last month, he insulted him in front of the staff, called him a failure. I couldn't bear it. His eyes burned with anguish, but he shook his head. But I didn't kill him. I swear it. Poirot's gaze softened, but his mind was relentless. And this powder, monsieur, how does it find its way into your cigarette case, buried in the snow? I don't know. Leclerc's voice rose, desperate. Someone took it, placed it there. I haven't seen it since last week. Poirot turned to Dr. Moreau, handing him the case. Doctor, you have the means to test this powder. Is it cyanide? Moreau nodded, taking the case with care. I can confirm it now, he said, retreating to a corner table where he had set up a small testing kit. Using a reagent from his supplies, he sprinkled a drop onto the powder, which turned a faint blue. Potassium cyanide, he declared, his voice steady. A small amount, but lethal in concentration. The room seemed to contract, the weight of the evidence pressing down. Poirot's eyes returned to Leclerc, whose face was now a mask of despair. Monsieur Leclerc, he said, his voice low but unyielding, the evidence points to you. The poison, in your case, your access to the meal, your hatred for the victim, yet you claim innocence. Convince me. Leclerc's voice broke, his hands clenching. I stole the cyanide, he confessed, the words tumbling out. From the medical kit, 2 days ago, I thought of using it, yes, to make him pay. But I couldn't. I hid it in my case, locked in my quarters. Someone must have taken it, used it to kill him, and left the case outside to point to me. Poirot's mustache twitched, his mind racing. The confession was a revelation, but it complicated the puzzle. If Leclerc spoke the truth, another hand had wielded the poison, using his theft to cloak their own guilt. He turned to the others, his gaze sweeping over Miss Vane and Dubois. And you, mademoiselle, monsieur, what do you know of this? Miss Vane's eyes widened, her voice trembling. Nothing, Monsieur Poirot. I swear, I had no part in this. I hated him, yes, but I couldn't. Her voice trailed off, her hands clutching her reticule. Dubois, his face pale, shook his head. I knew nothing of the cyanide. The medical kit was in my office, locked. I reported it misplaced, but I found it before the meal. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Yet the kit was accessed, monsieur. And you, with your own grievances against Hawthorne, had opportunity to know its contents. Dubois stiffened, his voice sharp. I did not touch it. My duty is to this train, not to revenge. Poirot stepped back, his hands clasped behind him, his mind reconstructing the crime. Leclerc's confession explained the cyanide source, but the cigarette case in the snow suggested a deliberate act either Leclerc's own attempt to dispose of evidence, or another's to implicate him. The locked car, the swift poison, pointed to a plan executed with precision, and Leclerc's role as server made him the most likely culprit. Yet his anguish, his claim of theft, rang with a note of truth. Monsieur Leclerc, Poirot said, his voice firm, you stole the cyanide, you admit. You served the meal. You had motive and means. But the heart of Hercule Poirot seeks the whole truth. I believe you planned to harm Monsieur Hawthorne, but perhaps another hand acted first or used your plan to their own end. Leclerc's eyes filled with tears, but he said nothing, his silence a heavy weight. Poirot turned to the others. The motive is unraveled, but the act remains. The poison reached Monsieur Hawthorne's plate in this car, under your eyes. One of you knows more than you say. The snow outside continued to fall, sealing the midnight express in its icy prison. The dining car, with its locked doors and hidden truths, was a crucible of human nature, and Poirot, with his relentless pursuit of order, was closer to the truth. The cigarette case, the cyanide, Leclerc's confessional, were pieces of the puzzle, and Poirot's little gray cells were poised to fit them together, revealing the murderer in their midst. Chapter 10. The other suspects cleared the midnight express. Entombed in the relentless alpine snow, stood as a silent witness to the grim drama unfolding within its opulent confines. The dining car, its polished mahogany and flickering chandeliers, now a backdrop to a relentless pursuit of truth, held an air of taut anticipation. Hercule Poirot, his small figure radiating an unyielding authority, stood at the center of the room, his sharp eyes glinting with the clarity of a mind that had unraveled the threads of motive and opportunity. The snow outside fell in heavy, silent curtains, sealing the train in a frozen world, but within, the heat of revelation burned brightly. Pierre Leclerc's confession had shifted the puzzle's pieces. His admission of stealing cyanide from the medical kit, a damning thread, that pointed to his guilt. Yet Poirot, with his unerring instinct for the nuances of human nature, sensed a complexity beneath the surface. The cigarette case, found in the snow with traces of the poison, suggested either Leclerc's desperate attempt to conceal his crime or another's cunning effort to frame him. The locked dining car, the swift acting cyanide, and the motives of resentment, fear, and humiliation wove a tapestry that demanded precision to unravel. Now, with the waiter's confession laid bare, Poirot turned his attention to the other. Suspects Miss Clara Vane and Monsieur Dubois to test their roles in this intricate crime. The four figures stood before him. Leclerc, his sallow face etched with anguish, his hands trembling. Miss Vane, her delicate frame rigid, her hazel eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Dubois, clutching his logbook, his thin mustache twitching with nervous energy. And Dr. Moreau, the train's physician, whose clinical detachment offered a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. Poirot's presence commanded silence, the passengers and staff alike hanging on his every word, as though the truth itself rested in his meticulous hands. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice calm but resonant, cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade. We have reached a pivotal moment. A man is dead, poisoned by cyanide in this locked car, and the evidence points to Monsieur Leclerc. Yet Hercule Poirot does not rest on evidence alone. He seeks the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Let us examine each of you, to see where innocence lies, and where guilt festers. He turned first to Miss Vane, his gaze softening but unyielding. Mademoiselle Vane, you sat opposite Monsieur Hawthorne, bound to him by a letter of blackmail, letter that threatened your brother's ruin. This is a motive, most profound, n'est-ce pas? The heart of a sister, pushed to desperation, might turn to drastic measures. Miss Vane's hands tightened around her reticule, her voice trembling, but clear. I hated him, Monsieur Poirot, I confess it. His threats were a chain around my heart. But I swear, I did not touch his food, his wine, nothing. I sat there, enduring his boasts, his cruelty, because I had no choice. I am no murderer. Eyes narrowed, studying her with the precision of a jeweler examining a gem. Your words ring with sincerity, mademoiselle, but let us test them against the facts. You were at the table, yes, but the meal was served by Monsieur Leclerc. The kitchen, as Chef Renaud attests, prepared the coq au vin without poison. The cyanide was added in this car, during service. Did you, mademoiselle, have opportunity to tamper with the plate? Her eyes widened, a flush creeping up her cheeks. No, monsieur, I never left my seat. The plate was placed before him by Pierre. I touched nothing but my own fork, my own glass. Poirot nodded, his mind reconstructing the scene. The timeline was tight. Leclerc had served the meal at 11:30, and Hawthorne was dead by 11:45. Miss Vane, seated across from him, had no access to the kitchen or the service door. Her hands, trembling and delicate, were not those of a poisoner slipping cyanide into a sauce under the eyes of a crowded dining car. Bon, he said softly. Your motive is clear, mademoiselle, but your opportunity is lacking. For now, I believe you are not the hand that struck. Miss Vane's shoulders sagged, a tear slipping down her cheek, but she held his gaze with quiet resolve. Poirot turned to Dubois, whose nervous tics had intensified, his fingers clutching the logbook as though it could shield him from scrutiny. Monsieur Dubois, Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. You, too, bore a grudge against Monsieur Hawthorne, a demotion, a wound to your pride, inflicted by his influence. And the medical kit, from which the cyanide was stolen, was in your care. Tell me, why should I not suspect you? Dubois's face paled, his mustache twitching violently. I had no part in this, Monsieur Poirot, he said, his voice sharp with indignation. Yes, I resented Hawthorne. He cost me my position, my dignity. But I was at the front of the train when he died, checking the engine with the crew. My logbook confirms it here. See for yourself. He thrust the book forward, its pages open to a meticulously recorded entry, 11:30 p.m. Engine inspection, front car. Poirot took the logbook, his eyes scanning the precise handwriting. The entry was clear, corroborated by a junior steward's initials. Dubois's alibi placed him far from the dining car at the critical moment, and the locked service door, controlled by Leclerc, further limited his opportunity. The medical kit, though, remained a point of intrigue. The kit, monsieur, said his voice low. You reported it misplaced, then found. Could another have accessed it under your watch? Dubois hesitated, his eyes darting to Leclerc. It was in my office, locked. Only I have the key. I noticed it in the wrong drawer that afternoon, but I secured it before the meal. I swear, I touched nothing inside. Poirot's mustache twitched, his mind cataloging the conductor's words. Dubois's demotion was a motive, but his alibi was solid, and the kit's security, while questionable, did not directly implicate him. The poison's path, Poirot reasoned, led back to Leclerc, who had admitted to stealing the cyanide. He turned to the waiter, whose anguish had deepened, his dark eyes hollow with despair. Monsieur Leclerc, Poirot said, his voice now a quiet thunder, you have confessed to stealing the cyanide, to harboring hatred for Monsieur Hawthorne. The cigarette case, found in the snow, bears your initials and traces of the poison. You served the meal, you held the key to the service door. All points to you, yet you claim another used your plan. Convince me, monsieur, why I should believe you. Leclerc's voice broke, his hands trembling. I stole the cyanide, yes, to make him suffer as he made us suffer. But I couldn't do it. I locked it in my case, in my quarters. Someone took it, used it, and left the case outside to point to me. I swear, I served the plate as it came from the kitchen. I added nothing. Poirot's eyes gleamed, his mind reconstructing the crime. The footprints in the snow, the cigarette case, the locked door all suggested Leclerc's guilt, yet his confession of intent, coupled with his claim of theft, introduced a shadow of doubt. Had another knowing of his plan, seized the opportunity to act, framing him in the process. The locked car limited the suspects, and neither Miss Vane nor Dubois had the access Leclerc possessed. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot said, his voice rising with finality, the truth emerges. Mademoiselle Vane, your fear of Hawthorne was real, but your hands did not touch his meal. Monsieur Dubois, your resentment was deep, but your alibi holds, and the kit's security, while flawed, does not condemn you. Monsieur Leclerc, you stole the cyanide, you served the meal, and the evidence points to you alone. The footprints in the snow were yours, made in a moment of panic to dispose of the case after the deed. You slipped the poison into the sauce, knowing its richness would mask the taste, and acted with the speed of vengeance. Leclerc collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. I did it, he whispered, his voice a broken sob. I poured the cyanide into his sauce, just a pinch, when I served the plate. I couldn't stand his cruelty any longer. My father, he deserved justice. The room fell silent, the weight of the confession settling like the snow outside. Poirot's expression softened, but his resolve was unshaken. The truth is revealed, he said quietly. A crime born of pain, but a crime nonetheless. The Midnight Express, stranded in its icy prison, bore witness to the unraveling of a murderer's heart. Poirot, with his little gray cells, had cleared the innocent and cornered the guilty, restoring order to the chaos of murder. The snow continued to fall, but the truth, cold and unyielding, had been laid bare. Chapter 11. Justice on the Tracks. The Midnight Express, still gripped by the unyielding alpine snow, stood as a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its opulent walls. The dining car, its polished mahogany and crystal chandeliers, now dimmed by the weight of truth, was a hushed arena where the echoes of Pierre Leclerc's confession lingered. Hercule Poirot, his small figure radiating a quiet authority, stood near the center of the room, his sharp eyes softened by a flicker of melancholy. The snow outside fell in relentless sheets, sealing the train in a frozen cocoon, but within, the fire of justice burned steadily. Kindled by Poirot's relentless pursuit of order, Leclerc sat slumped in a chair, his sallow face etched with despair, his hands trembling as the weight of his confession settled upon him. Miss Clara Vane, her delicate frame rigid with relief, clutched her reticule, her hazel eyes glistening with unshed tears. Monsieur Dubois, his logbook now resting on a table, stood with a stiffness that betrayed his unease, his thin mustache no longer twitching but set in a grim line. Dr. Moreau, the train's physician, remained at the edge of the group, his clinical detachment a stark contrast to the raw emotion in the air. Poirot's voice, when he spoke, was calm but resonant, carrying the weight of finality. Mesdames et messieurs, the puzzle is complete. A man is dead, poisoned by cyanide, in this locked car, and the hand that struck him has confessed. Monsieur Leclerc, driven by the pain of humiliation and injustice, took the life of Monsieur Hawthorne. The truth, though bitter, restores order to this chaos. He turned to Leclerc, his gaze steady but not unkind. Monsieur, your act was born of a wounded heart, but it was a choice. You stole the cyanide, you served the meal, you slipped the poison into the sauce. The cigarette case, discarded in the snow, was your attempt to conceal the evidence, but the snow, like truth, does not yield easily. Leclerc's head bowed, his voice a broken whisper. I couldn't bear it any longer. His cruelty, his insults. My father's memory deserved better. I thought it would end the pain. Tears fell, unheeded, onto his clasped hands. Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign of his mind reflecting on the tragedy of vengeance. The heart seeks justice, monsieur, but murder is a chain that binds the soul. You have confessed, and justice will follow. He turned to Dubois, whose face was pale but composed. Monsieur Dubois, you will contact the authorities via telegraph. The snow delays their arrival, but the truth must be recorded. Monsieur Leclerc will be confined until they reach us. Dubois nodded, his voice steady. I will send the message at once. There is a storage car, secure, where he can be held. He hesitated, then added, Monsieur Poirot, I regret my part in this. My negligence with the medical kit allowed this tragedy. Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone was firm. Negligence, monsieur, is not murder. You bore your own grievances, but your hands are clean. See that the kit is secured henceforth. Dubois inclined his head and left to make the arrangements, his steps heavy with the burden of his role. Poirot turned to Miss Vane, who had risen, her face a mask of gratitude and sorrow. Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice trembling. Thank you, I feared. I feared I would be blamed, that my brother's shame would be exposed. You have given me hope. Poirot inclined his head, his expression gentle. Mademoiselle, your fear was real, but your heart is innocent. The letter from Hawthorne was a cruel chain, but it did not lead you to murder. Go now, and find peace. Miss Vane's eyes filled with tears, and she murmured a soft mercy, before retreating to her compartment, her steps lighter, but still hesitant. Dr. Moreau, with a nod to Poirot, followed, to ensure the passenger's calm, leaving the detective. Alone with Leclerc, Poirot regarded the waiter, whose despair seemed to fill the room. Monsieur Leclerc, he said softly, you sought justice for your father, but you found only tragedy. The law will judge you, but I, Hercule Poirot, see the pain that drove you. It is a lesson, Nan, that vengeance consumes both victim and perpetrator. Leclerc nodded, his voice barely audible. I see it now, monsieur. Too late. Poirot turned away, his gaze drifting to the frosted windows, where the snow continued to fall. The dining car, once a haven of luxury, was now a testament to the fragility of human resolve. He thought of Hawthorne, a man whose arrogance had sown the seeds of his destruction, and of Leclerc, whose pain had blossomed into murder. The balance of justice, Poirot knew, was a delicate one, and he had restored it with the precision of his little gray cells. As Dubois returned, accompanied by a steward, to escort Leclerc to the storage car, Poirot stepped back, his hands clasped. Behind him, the waiter rose, his movements slow, and followed the steward without resistance, his head bowed. The dining car fell silent, The weight of the resolution settling like the snow outside, Poirot remained, his thoughts turning to the broader implications of the case. The railway, under Hawthorne's influence, had fostered resentment among its staff, a systemic flaw that had culminated in murder. He resolved to speak with Dubois later, to urge reforms that might prevent such tragedies. For now, though, his work was done, the truth had been uncovered, the guilty named, and order restored. The Midnight Express, stranded in its icy prison, awaited the thaw, but within its walls, the clarity of justice had begun to melt the shadows of deceit. Poirot, with his unyielding commitment to truth, stood ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, his mind already turning to the journey's end. Chapter 12. The journey resumes. The Midnight Express, freed at last from the alpine snow's relentless grip, stirred to life with a low, resonant hum, its wheels grinding against the cleared tracks as it resumed its journey toward Paris. The dining car, its polished mahogany and crystal chandeliers, restored to their former elegance, bore no visible trace of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls, yet the air carried a subtle weight, a memory of the truth Hercule Poirot had uncovered. The detective sat alone at a corner table, his small, neat figure framed by the frosted window, where the moonlit peaks receded into the distance. He sipped a fresh tisane, the porcelain cup steady in his meticulous hands. His sharp eyes softened by a reflective calm. The snow, now thinning to a delicate flurry, no longer held the train captive, but the events of the past hours lingered. In Poirot's mind, Pierre Leclerc, the waiter whose resentment had blossomed into murder, was confined in the storage car, awaiting the authorities who would meet the train at its next stop. Miss Clara Vane, her delicate heart freed from the shadow of suspicion, had retired to her compartment, her gratitude to Poirot, a quiet light in her haunted eyes. Monsieur Dubois, chastened by his role in the railway's systemic flaws, had vowed to advocate for better treatment of the staff, a promise Poirot intended to ensure was kept. The dining car was nearly empty now, its passengers dispersed to their berths, their whispers of the murder subdued by exhaustion and relief. The chandeliers cast a gentle glow, their light no longer faltering but steady, as though reflecting the order Poirot had restored. He opened his notebook, its pages filled with precise, elegant notes on the case, and reviewed the threads that had led to the truth: the locked car, the cyanide's bitter almond scent, the cigarette case in the snow, Leclerc's anguished confession. Each had been a piece of a puzzle that only his little gray cells could assemble. Poirot's thoughts turned to the human heart, the crucible where motives of pain and vengeance had forged a crime. Reginald Hawthorne, with his arrogance and cruelty, had sown the seeds of his own destruction, wielding his influence like a bludgeon against those who served him. Leclerc, driven by the memory of his father's humiliation, had sought justice in poison, only to chain himself to guilt. Miss Vane, bound by blackmail, had endured in silence, her innocence a fragile shield against suspicion. Dubois, his pride wounded by demotion, had borne his burden without crossing the line into murder. Each, in their way, was a testament to the fragility of human resolve, and Poirot, with his unyielding commitment to truth, had illuminated their paths. He closed his notebook, his fingers lingering on its leather cover. The Midnight Express, now moving steadily through the night, was no longer a prison, but a vessel carrying its passengers toward their destinies. The authorities would take look, and justice, however cold, would follow its course. Yet Poirot felt a pang of melancholy, a recognition of the tragedy that vengeance wrought. The heart seeks justice, he murmured to himself, but it is reason that must prevail. The steward approached, offering a fresh pot of tisane, but Poirot waved him away with a polite nod. He rose, adjusting his impeccable waistcoat, and stepped into the corridor, his polished shoes silent on the carpet. The train's rhythm, steady and reassuring, was a counterpoint to the chaos it had briefly harbored. Poirot paused at a window, gazing out at the receding Alps. their snow-draped peaks a silent witness to the drama now concluded in Paris. New challenges awaited, cases that would test his little gray cells, puzzles that would demand his relentless pursuit of order. But for now, the Midnight Express carried him forward, its journey a metaphor for his own, a quest for truth amid the shadows of human nature. Poirot's mustache twitched, a faint smile curving his lips. The case was closed, the murderer unmasked, and the world, for a moment, was set right. As the train rounded a bend, the lights of a distant station glimmered on the horizon. Poirot returned to his compartment, his mind already turning to the next mystery, the next test of his unparalleled intellect. The Midnight Express, with its secrets laid bare, steamed onward, and Hercule Poirot, the master of order, was ready for whatever lay ahead in the City of Light.